Howdy friends, welcome back to another video. Sorry that I've been off for the past few nights. I've been very overbooked with a lot of other videos in the making. So as we know, the AP Euro test is tomorrow. So what I'm going to try and do is going to go over some important ideas over the entire course of the course, and hopefully I'm going to try and cover as much ground in as much time as I can. So might be going at a brisk pace and I might be jumping back and forth, so let's just get into it. So what I'm first going to be talking about is the age of exploration. So now one of the most important things you're going to really have to know is the Columbian Exchange. Columbian Exchange was, you guessed it, made by Christopher Columbus. So this term is what was between Europe, the Americas, and Africa. So what you really need to know is that this immensely changed basically both sides of the Atlantic, which in Europe it brought from Europe it brought diseases to the New World, and from the New World it brought new types of food and vegetables to Europe, and it really changed their agricultural side of things in Europe. So this was one of the biggest things of the Age of Exploration. And it also completely changed the labor status in Africa, where they took a ton of slaves from Africa and moved them to all over the world. So another big part of the Age of Exploration is what we're going to know is the conquistadors. So most of the conquistadors came from Spain and Portugal, and they really were the pioneers of getting face to face with the New World from Western Europe. So during the age of exploration, it was actually they were the ones who opened up Europe to see what was out in the rest of the world. They tried to make new trade routes, and they conquered the natives, and that's actually where they got the name conquistador, which means to conquer other people. And they basically started colonies all over the world. So basically, Spain and Portugal were able to dominate trade all around the world, and they made empires based off the sea. And now there were a lot of benefits to Europe, but meanwhile in the New World, natives were being killed off, and as I said before, the diseases were spreading between them, and a lot of people died from both genocides and diseases. So basically the conquistadors were the military, and their right behind conquering the New World was based off of religion and reassurance from the monarchy. So domination is in fact the central theme of the imperial vision, and with colonization with the Dutch and British, that's going to come a little bit after Spain and Portugal, but it also is pretty it does kind of the same facts and negatives. So back to medieval Europe, I'm going to talk quickly about the sorry about that, I don't have tripod. I'm going to talk about the Council of Trent. So the Council of Trent was a meeting called together by Pope Paul III. It was one of the major movements of the Counter-Reformation, which was a reaction of the Catholic Church. Yeah, sorry, I need to find a better place for my phone. Okay, hopefully that'll work. So, as I was talking about the Council of Trent, what it basically was trying to do was, it was part of the church trying to fight the Protestant Reformation, which I touched upon in an entire last video. Go watch that if you want to learn about the Protestant Reformation. So the council, basically, it reinstated the church's doctrines, and it affirmed their teachings, and it just wanted to basically go against Martin Luther. Like I said, so quick concept you know is transubstantiation. So Catholics, they believe that it was the blood and body of Christ, while Martin Luther and the Protestants believed that it was transformation of the Spirit. So basically, this council didn't really do much. It still made the Protestants still wanted to be separate from the Catholic Church, and they still were pushing for reform. So you really need to have to know that this is a part where in Europe where the church is really pushing for the Protestants to get back, but they really just want to separate and they want reform to the church. Okay, now next to the defenestration of Prague. So this may not sound important, but it actually directly led to the 30 Years' War. So in the Holy Roman Empire, it's pretty calm at the time, but the Kingdom of Bohemia, which was part of the Holy Roman Empire, it was ruled by the Habsburg dynasty, who were Catholic at the time. So the Habsburg did not, in fact, force any Catholicism on their Protestant subjects. But then Ferdinand of Styria, who was a Catholic, he was elected King of Bohemia, and he did not support Protestant rights, and he dissolved a lot of the Protestant assemblies who were elected, and he sent a lot of Catholic lords to announce his intent that Bohemia wanted to remain Catholic. So this is pretty important for the test because the 30 Years' War was came directly from this, because as Protestants wanted to form their own religion, but Catholics wanted to suppress them and keep Catholicism on them. Okay, to the Diet of Worms. Diet of Worms was an assembly called by Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, and he wanted to find out what he was going to do with Martin Luther. So historically, the Holy Roman Empire had been Catholic, granted the name, and by the Pope, but in 1521, after Martin Luther's writings had begun the Protestant Reformation, and the subjects of the Holy Roman Empire found themselves questioning the reliability of the papal interpretation of the scripture, Martin Luther was then summoned to the Worms, and he had 20 days to find out what was going to happen to him. So Martin Luther did not actually do anything about this. He merely stated that he did not want to take anything back, and he said that in the good conscience that he would only be talking about the sacrilegious things in God's eyes. So after finished, he actually just said, "Here I stand, I can do no other." So now Luther's actions are they're gonna be a sign of things that are about to come. So the Diet did not specifically work in Europe, as Luther did not do anything as a result of it, and it's just going to spark the Protestants even more to want to form their own religion and try and reform the Catholic Church if possible. To the Edict of Nantes, the French Wars of Religion, as I talked about in the first video too, it completely decimated France, and it just left it destroyed. So, as I said, it was between the Huguenots and the Protestants living in France, but it was mainly fought by the Catholics, which was the main religion at the time. So Henry IV, he saw the damage that was done by his country by the French Wars of Religion, and he wanted to get a peace agreement between them. So this was the Edict of Nantes. So what the edict basically did was it made it clear that the French Huguenots did not need to be treated as a second class or heretics. They had to keep the same rights as Catholics, and they had to be tolerated as a separate religion and be considered as the majority. So this edict freed France from the wars that had been going on for the last greater part of the 16th century, and it eventually allowed for the growth of secularism in later time periods. So this era of religious reformation is another example of religious chaos, and under the absolute monarch, basically, it shows how like a social group, such as like the Huguenots, fought for a place in France and wanted a more monarchy type system. Okay, to the feudalism, another key concept that you're going to have to know for the exam. So feudalism was a means of social order during the turmoil and chaos of the Middle Ages. It was it affected both political and cultural aspects of life. So with feudalism, it was through the serfs, then the lords, then the kings, and they were all basically like a pyramid scheme, and they were all bound to each other. The lords owned land, and the serfs were bound to them, and they had to raise crops and provide food and goods for the lord, and then in return, the lord would protect them from any harm. So then the lords owed allegiance to the king, and the king was in charge of marshaling the armies in case there was war, and they provided justice. So feudalism was the primary form of society for centuries. And since for the exam you're going to have to know transition and connectivity, you're going to have to know that the feudal system declined to do a lot of, it didn't work due to a lot of things. First, the economics were changing during the age of exploration, which I talked before, and the religious authority of the Pope was starting to be challenged as people were starting to think, and peasants began revolting because they wanted more personal and social rights. So, with feudalism goes with mercantilism, which was probably the dominant economic theory in Europe during the period between like 16th and 18th century. So, the key requirements of mercantilism came from a nation's drive to establish colonies quickly and efficiently. Anything that the colony produced was to be shipped and sold only to the home country, and then all efforts for a nation's export had to be greater than its imports, and all gold and silver that the nation encountered must be hoarded and kept with domestic money supplies. So this policy was the framework of in England, in Spain, and in France when they formed all their colonies in the New World. So it's really important to know for the exam that it was extremely profitable, helping to push Europe out of the Middle Ages and into the dominant region of the world affairs, but it also predecesses capitalism, which is kind of important too. So back to Martin Luther, we're going to need to know the 95 theses for the exam. So as I talked about in the first video too, the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther, 1517, he wrote 95 things that were wrong with the church, and he posted it on wall. So this was basically just a series of complaints about the abuses of Catholic power, and he just decided that there shouldn't be selling of indulgences, there shouldn't be a connection between church and state, and that there is corruption in the church taking place all across of Europe. So what relates to this basically is Gutenberg's printing press. So with this, it made the document able to spread it all across Europe. So, and it really went all over Europe because of the printing press, and a lot of people agreed with the 95 Theses, and that a lot of people were getting tired of the Catholic Church, which then led to the Protestant Reformation. So, another important thing we're going to have to note is the Peace of Westphalia. So, what the Peace of Westphalia basically did was end the 30 Years' War in the Holy Roman Empire. So, what it basically said is that Spain could no longer deny the authority and freedom of the Dutch Republic. It also really changed Europe, that it forced the acceptance of the Protestant Reformation. So the Catholic Church is now not able to basically bully Catholic monarchs to interfere with the Protestant rulers, and it effectively allowed religious freedom and tolerance for all of Europeans. So it really changed the dynamics of Europe at the time. So formally, it might have been right, but with the Peace of Westphalia, balance started to be maintained in Europe, and through an intricate set of alliances. Basically, if one nation went to war, all of the other alliances were to bear its power, and then basically the shift of power led to the growth of nationalism in Europe, and then it went to the World War One, which we'll talk about later. Back to world exploration and going against the Catholic Church and Reformation, we're gonna have to know the Spanish Inquisition. So this was not just one Inquisition, but it was several that took across that was made by Spain. So basically, this was a council that it wanted to guarantee that Catholicism was being forced upon all the subjects in Spain, and that it affected everyone, and it also wanted to get rid of Jews and Muslims in Spain. So a lot of people were tortured and executed for not being Catholic, but the main thing you're going to have to know is that the enforcement of religious and political authority at the time was also at a time when religious pluralism didn't exist. So now switching topics, we're going to go to Renaissance in the Industrial Age. So key concept we're going to have to know here is absolutism, which took place in Europe through the 17th and 18th centuries, basically. What it basically was a monarch that was at the top of the government who had unrestricted authority over the state and the people. So power with these absolutist governments is usually heredity and is being passed down from father to son lineage for many years. Prime example of this is Louis the X, and it went all the way to Louis the 18th. So that's the concept of absolutism, but in reality, it was kind of offset by the power of the clergy, the aristocracy, and later the middle class. So Europe was dominated by absolutist governments for a long time, and that was eventually torn down by a lot of revolutions who did not like the idea of absolutism and wanted to switch to democracy. So next concept we're going to talk about is Deism. So the Age of Enlightenment saw the rise of rationalism and a trust of empiricism. So this kind of coincided with the effects of the Protestant Revolution, and it ran a scrutiny of organized religion, and it left a lot of people confused. So what this ended up resulting in was the growth of Deism. So what Deism basically is that it's kind of the belief that you don't need a religion to see that the universe was designed by just one single all-powerful creator, and instead you just have to study and observe the natural world to see that the complexity of it must have been designed by an all-powerful human being. So Deism sprouted from philosophers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Baron de Montesquieu. Their writings eventually contributed to the expansion of the French Revolution, and even more political philosophers that helped us back the French and American revolutions were hugely influenced by these deist thinkers. And since they no longer believed that religion had to be the center of politics, it led to confusion and chaos. So what we're gonna what's up?
What?
Nothing.
Why did you stop?
That's it. Gotcha. Sorry for that. There was a small break. What we're going to move on to next is industrialization. So, industrialization basically, it started the beginning of the modern age, and a lot of new inventions are appearing at this time, and a result of industrialization is that it's going to change many of the economies in many of the countries in Europe. So, industrialization is, simpling this down, is basically the process of incorporating machines to produce goods, which was especially clothing and textiles. So, although industrialization at the time brought the growth of steam power to transport goods and power to new machines, um, this basically came about from transition of using wood to then coal as a fuel source. So, industrialization, it affected all levels of society, and people basically were able to climb the social ladder as they pleased based on how well they worked, and they also looked at they focused more on themselves, and they wanted to really know the quality of life and what natural rights they had and shared with others. So although many things are going to produced in mass with these new technological advances, the income are rising and products are being increased, there's still discontent. So basically what happened during the 19th century is that socialism is now sprouting up in an effort to take on this industrialization system, and money is being separated between the wealthy and the poor, and the gap between the rich and the poor is growing, which is a very big concept, and the economic system is now becoming an institution of power in itself, and it's sparking a lot of instances of class warfare. Next concept we're going to talk to you about is laissez faire. So laissez faire was an economic policy in which government took a hands-off approach. That's the translation, laissez faire, which means hands off. So before laissez faire, a lot of Europe's government took control of the economy, and especially during the times of famine or war, laissez faire went against the intervention of the government. So laissez faire, as I said, it originated from France, and its economic policies are going to be tested during the reign of Louis XV. Policies are being worked on and tested over the past 10 years. So when a food shortage actually hit France, merchants would distribute and sell their grain abroad for a better price. So laissez faire was one of the many policies that contributed to the hatred of the aristocracy, and the clergy would help. This is what's going to basically help bring about the French Revolution. Next concept we're going to move on to is the Napoleonic Code. So what the Napoleonic Code basically refers to is the French laws that Napoleon Bonaparte's empire enforced upon their own citizens and any citizens that they conquered. So it was very revolutionary at the time, very new. What the laws basically did was that they created a uniform system that spread all throughout Europe, and it replaced the patchwork of a lot of feudal systems in Europe, and it basically changed all the rules. So what it basically did was that it did not allow for class-based privileges, which had never been done before. The state could not force religion, and government cannot be created by more like a very powerful politician, and what the government needs to do is that it has to be filled with people who are qualified with their jobs and not by just a singular person like with the absolutist ideas. So as countries throughout the 19th and 20th centuries are increasingly trying to get rid of the colonization and feudalism, they're going to be turning to these ideas for a model on how you would do that. So next we're going to talk about the Reign of Terror. So as I talked about in the second video about the French Revolution, the Reign of Terror is one of the bloodiest and worst portions of the French Revolution. So during the Reign of Terror, actually 30,000 French citizens were executed by the Committee of Public Safety, which was led by Robespierre. So since leaders of the French Revolution had promised the commoners equality for all under the law and no more economic abuse by the government, these promises are going to be, they felt that they weren't kept to the masses, and they felt really cheated, and there's a cry for blood. So no one is really safe from the guillotine at this time, and it actually comes to symbolize the French Revolution. So the significance of the Reign of Terror, and why I'm specifically talking about that concept of the French Revolution, is that the rest of Europe's aristocrats began to fear revolution in their own countries, and and what they wanted to do was to tighten their restrictions so something like this couldn't happen to their country. And what this basically did was just get the citizens even more pissed off, and it actually led to more revolutions than it stopped. We're going to be talking about next is social Darwinism. So what it basically talks about is that the natural world, it's going to support the claim that people on the top are going to inherit the most wealth, and the weak are going to basically stay weak, and that they're going to eventually die off, which is basically summed up with the phrase survival of the fittest, which is a pretty known concept. So what social Darwinism also said was that it believed in specific ways to reward strength and discipline weakness. So what this theory is basically doing in the first half of the 20th century is that it's fueling the thoughts behind fascism and imperialism and racism all throughout Europe during that time. Next back, we're going to talk about during the French Revolution was the three estates. So what the three estates were, as I talked about in the second video with France, is that they were the three social classes that made up France. What the first estate consisted of was the French clergy, the second was the French nobility, and the third estate was everyone else, which was 95% of the population. Now, the main importance of the third estate was how the estates were taxed. So the first and second were exempt from taxes, and then all the other went to the third estate. So this was a big burden on the third estate, and this unfair taxation basically fueled for the French Revolution, as I talked about before. Next, I'm going to start talking about World War II to the Cold War. First thing that you're really going to need to know is the Balkan powder keg. So what this name basically is, it was given to the Balkans during the early 20th century. The reason why it was called this was because the Balkan had become a major point of contention between the powers of Europe in the time. So in addition to being a prominent contention, the local people of the Balkans had they had a strong upsurge in nationalism, and eventually they felt that they should govern themselves instead of the Western and Eastern imperial powers that were basically in charge of them at the time. So some Balkan states at the time were like Greece, Serbia, Austria, and Montenegro. So what the Balkan powder keg basically did was it basically was a power force that forced Western and Eastern Europe against each other, and basically led to World War I. So basically now all the main empires are gonna come to an end. So this is actually a really important part of events in European history, because it's now going to indicate the shift away from the imperial system, and it's going to go towards a system of sovereign nation states that is basically the foundations of today. I really don't have much more time to talk about anything. Just know about the gap between the rich and the poor, and how feudalism moved to more of the empire, and then back to democracy, which is now. Thank you for watching the video. I hope everyone gets 5 on the exam.